and missionaries and that kind of thing. So that's how that's supposed to work. But if you're not supporting church planters, they're only doing a portion, a percentage of the work. And most of these ministries that want to classify themselves as missionaries and get support, they're doing it because it's easy, they think. I'll just go out and get support. And a lot of people will support them.
Once a church is planted and becomes autonomous, does the missionary remain as the pastor, or is it taken over by an indigenous pastor that he's trained?
That's a really good question. Technically, if he stays on as their pastor, then his support should end. They should be able to support him 100% as their pastor. But in a lot of cases, especially on the field, for example, in Mexico, I was not allowed by the government to take a salary of the church. I couldn't do it. To do that, I would have had to go through the process to become a citizen in Mexico. Now, some countries aren't like that. Some countries you can. In fact, there's a preacher out of Lehigh Valley Baptist Church in Pennsylvania that recently, I started seeing his Facebook post that he was moving to Africa. I'm like, what in the world? And so I talked to his pastor. I said, what's going on? He needs support. You know, he's a good guy. I know him. Brother Jeff Goss. And I said, does he need support? He said, no, they're going to support him 100%. It's an indigenous church. And so they need a pastor. They wanted an American. And so they called him as their pastor. So he's going there to work. He's going to be receiving a salary from them. So yeah, that's fine. But technically, if you're going to stay on as a pastor of an autonomous church, they should either be supporting you or you should be getting your income by another source. And in other words, if we are supporting long-term another church, with shekels come shackles. Does that make sense? So are they technically independent and autonomous if they're depending on another church to pay their pastor? Are they? No. And so we have leverage, do we not? If we were doing that, we were supporting this man and he's pastoring that church, we have some leverage. So if he says, well, I'm going to start teaching such and such, we're not in agreement on this and that, we would say, well, we're not going to support you anymore then. Well, that's going to put them in a pickle, isn't it? You see the conflict? What that means? So if a church is autonomous, they need to be completely self-supporting, including their pastor. And a lot of churches, even in the States, can't do that. So their pastor is what they call bivocational. He works a secular job, but to have another church financially supporting him as he pastors that church, that is a major issue. Because that church then is no longer technically autonomous. They have something over them that can be used to control them. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? That's a good question. And we've even had church planters here. When we take on a church planter, like Brother Alexander down in Florida or others, I'm up front with them when we take them on for support, and I tell them, look, if you become autonomous as a church and you stay on as that pastor, we'll give you 3 months to be established, and we're dropping the support. Because we cannot, and we've done it before. When I came into Bible Way, we had several men that we were supporting that were missionaries to churches that were already organized. There was one in Alaska. I don't remember where the other ones were. And so I talked to the men of the church. I said, I don't believe this is correct. Because we are technically supporting a church, an established autonomous church. How can they be autonomous if they're being helped and supported? Now, if a church, their building blows away, they need help getting a building rebuilt, we want to send an offering to help them, that's a different story. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a continuous month-by-month support paycheck. Then they are not autonomous. They're not able to do that. And a church should not organize until they're able to do it. A church should stay a mission of the mother church until they're ready to completely be autonomous. I think some churches get too antsy. They get excited. It's just like kids want to move out of home. I want to get married. I can't wait. And then they go get married to the wrong person, and then it falls apart later. Right? Now, how many have seen that? Same thing happens with churches. There is a mission, everything's going fine, they're seeing people saved, added to the congregation, but they are under the authority of another church at this point. And the pastor or the missionary is like, oh, I can't wait to make it to church, and we don't have to worry about having that authority, but I like the money. But they want to organize as a church, become autonomous, but still receive the money. You see the problem? So yeah, that's a good question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious, when they do become autonomous, and the church planter missionary does not stay there, does that mean that they have to find a pastor? Is it
Yes.
usually
Yeah, they would generally a missionary would not organize, I wouldn't, organize that church until they had a man ready to step in as their pastor.
and so then they could go plant another church?
Exactly.
Okay.
There's several things you want a church or mission to be ready or be able to do before you constitute that church. That's what we call it. They put up their constitution, they become autonomous. Number one, you want them to have a pastor. You really don't want to constitute a church if they don't have a long-term pastor. Not a missionary pastor, but a long-term pastor. Number two, they need to have finances available to pay their own bills and not be dependent upon other churches and groups. Number three, you want leadership in that church. And I don't think every church has to have deacons. That's not a requirement in the Bible for a church. But I think as that church grows, the pastor needs those deacons and maybe trustees. Trustees not a biblical position, but it's a position we have developed in the church to help the pastor to be a mainly physical part of the labor of the church. And so, but you want some kind of leadership. You want to have a Sunday school teacher or two or something like that in the church. So constituting a church with just two families would be, I think, very difficult because it's going to struggle. So you really want, 5, 6, 7 families before, and a pastor ready to be full-time or in that church, supported by them in some manner before you constitute as a church. And then yes, that missionary, if he decides not to be their pastor, then he would move on to another place. And we would continue to support a man like that. If he says, like Brother not Richardson, what's his name? Reinhardt. He's getting ready in Peru to constitute that church. I mean, they are in the last stages of getting the leadership set, getting things where it ought to be, getting a piece of property and a building started. He's going to have them well advanced into being a church and constitute that church. I don't think he even knows right now what he does next. He's still trying to seek the Lord's will in that. But I don't think his intention at all is to stay there.
Cusco?
Yes. So, but I'm not real sure what he'll do or how long this is even going to take. But I know that he has indicated in his recent letters that they are in the process of getting this set up to be autonomous. Is there any other questions? We got stuck on one page. All right. Next page, 44. Down at the bottom there, middle of the paragraph says, "But thanks be to God which giveth us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." So, if we do things correctly, that phrase, "in the Lord," means according to His word, or according to His desire or will. We do things in our own way, we're on our own. But if we do it in the Lord, the Bible tells us that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. What does that mean? You do it God's way. If you do it God's way, you'll have God's blessings and God's supply. But if you do it your way, you might be on your own. All right? But I think it's an important point that we need to be very, very clear in, that it should be a church authority issue or a church authority thing. It's not an individual mandate. And I kind of wrote this today. There's some things that I saw or happened that made me start thinking about this. I wrote something on Facebook about it, that there's so many organizations out there. You got camps, colleges, all kinds of things that say they're supporting the local church, and yet they themselves are not under the authority of a local church. How can that be scriptural? It's not. And then when I confront some of these missionaries that call me, and I say, well, we only support, we want to encourage and help missionaries that are sent through their local churches only. Oh, we're through our local church. I said, yeah, but it says a mission board here on your information. Well, all they do is they do our finances. I said, so did you have to agree to a doctrinal statement to be accepted by them and approved by them? What kind of authority do they have over you? What can they tell you to do or not do? If you signed a statement at all that was doctrinally related, they're telling you what you can and cannot teach and believe.
They have the authority to pull you off.
Yeah. And I said, that's not their job. That's the church's job. And so many churches have gladly said, let a board do this, because that's a lot of work. You know, especially churches that the pastor may be bivocational. He's doing everything he can to gather up enough information or stuff to do messages Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. He can't, on top of that, be spreading himself out with all the other things he believes. But if we do things God's way, he supplies. He always supplies the means, doesn't he? He always supplies the means. And so we just need to be obedient to God instead of trying to figure it out ourselves.
I think one thing you were talking about, a missionary that wants to still receive support when he has an autonomous body, that support is his security instead of the Lord being the church's security.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's a matter of faith as well, isn't it? All right, so anyway, let's move on. We'll probably discuss that a little bit more later on as we talk about history of missions. But page 45, he talks about the biblical mandate of partnership. And that's what this book is all about. It's more than just, let's send a support check to somebody. It's not just support, it's partnership. And that's what I've spent several years now doing. And one reason I really wanted somebody in the office was because I wanted to do more of this type thing, and I just didn't have the time to do it all. That is the communication with missionaries, stay on top of things. We had a missionary, his wife died, and I somehow missed it. I mean, months later, I come across some information that his wife had died, and I start going back through old prayer letters, and sure enough, months before, he mentioned a prayer letter that his wife had passed away. And I just started crying. I'm like, I can't believe I missed this. This guy needed moral support. He needed somebody to call him and tell him they're praying for him. And I didn't know. Because I didn't have the help to go through and read all these letters. You think, well, what's the problem? You got 80 missionaries. Some of them are writing 3-page letters. That's another thing, Jason. Don't write 3-page letters. If you're doing a letter every month, 1 page is plenty. Some of them write 3-page letters. Some of them write books. And a lot of their letters are just this, I found this in my studies, and they want to teach you something. That's not what a prayer letter is for. And I'm sure you've read those letters before, or seen them. They're missionaries, and they want to be looked at as, wow, he's a very spiritual fella, And so they spend their prayer letter talking about what the Lord showed them in the Bible. No, what I want to know is, what's he doing in your ministry and in your life? A lot of times when I read those kind of letters, I'm wondering, is anything going on in the field? Or do they have nothing to report, so they got to turn to teaching a Sunday school lesson? So anyway, you got all these letters to read. It's like reading a book every month, on top of everything else you got to do. And so, yeah, it's easy to forget stuff or overlook stuff. And so I tried to recruit some people in the church to read these letters. And several ladies said, yeah, we'll do that. And I said, just read the letter. Anything that is vitally important you think I ought to know, highlight it, then give the letter back to me. So she brings me a stack of letters next week. Every line in the letter was highlighted. Bless her heart. And so, but we've tried several of these. Now, Wendy, she reads every letter. She knows what's going on. You hear her on Wednesday night. I'm sure some people are like, oh, she's talking about these missionaries again. She reads their letters. She knows what they mean. She's on top of what's going on in their lives. That's what we need. Because that is a true partnership. And when a missionary is not giving us information, I write to him and I say, what's going on in your ministry? I'm glad that the Apostle Paul's letters have been great to you, and you've shared these lessons with me. But what's happening to you personally right now? What are your needs? We have a missionary, and I love him dearly. He's a good man. He will not share any needs. He says, I just leave that in God's hands. He said, I just pray, and God will, He'll supply it by putting it on somebody's heart. And I said, well, He gave us pencils and papers and typewriters to share information. Why don't you just tell us, that there's a need coming up? You don't even have to be specific. And then some guys are go to the, you know what this is, right? You know what it is?
Yeah.
What?
Poor. I need money.
It's an unspoken prayer request.
Yeah.
I had a preacher one time. He was talking about this missionary that came, and he got up on the altar to pray, and he put his feet out so everybody could see it, and he had holes worn in the bottom of his shoes. And so, okay, I understand maybe he really needed shoes, but put it in a prayer letter. That's why we send out these requests at your missions month. What do you need? But some of these guys won't say what they need, but they'll give you hints. It's funny. Jason, I got a lot to teach you.
Yeah.
Man, I tell you, some of these guys, you're like, "Grr." But anyway. So here on the next page, he said, I believe that it would be possible, and we're on the first paragraph on page 45, about halfway through it. I believe that it would be possible for a local church to financially support 100 missionaries without a genuine partnership with any of them. And you see what he's saying. It's easy to send a check and not know or care about what's going on. We one time had a missionary, this was in California, that we had supported for a long, long time. And then this guy came through, this evangelist came through and saw his letter on the wall. They said, you support that guy? The pastor was like, yeah. It's like, he hadn't been on the field for 3 years. He came home off the field. And so pastor called, back at the end they supported board missionaries. He called their board and they said, yes, he did leave the field. They said, why didn't you tell us? He said, that's not our responsibility to tell you. Well, yes, it is.
Sure.
If you're going to take on responsibility to send this missionary when it should be the church, you are responsible to tell us. The pastor was living.
Sure.
And so, but if we as a church had been connected to these missionaries the way we really should be, we probably would have picked up on that, don't you think?
So who got the money? The board?
Oh, he did.
The
I'm not sure if
missionary
they forwarded it to him
Oh.
or to his church. I don't know what was going on. I mean, I'm just a student at that church at that point. And it was early on because by the time I left and I was ordained by that church, they had stopped supporting board missionaries altogether. But at the time, they still had a few. I think they were in the process of eliminating them. But my pastor, rightly, he would not drop anybody just for that. They had already been supporting these men. And so he was waiting for an excuse to drop the support. But that was a pretty good excuse. Anyway. So yeah, I think that if you're not connected to these men, and you don't have a partnership with them, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And a lot of pastors complain about that. That, I don't know, missionaries and this, that, and the other. These men are just vacationing, and that's been known to happen. A missionary living in another field for years. I was just talking to Adam the other day about a guy. He's going to be in America this year. And I've wrote to him, I said, I want to see you. I want you to come talk to me. Because I've had 2 different men tell me that all he's doing is living as a tourist. As, living in a nice home, taking money and not doing anything. And so I'm going to have to talk with him. I don't know if he'll tell me the truth, but that happens to every church. So do we throw missions out because some men are taking advantage of it?
Yeah.
No, we don't. Are we going to be taken advantage of in our lives? Yes, we are. And that's where humility comes in. Because our pride says, well, bless God, we won't send any more money to any of them. That'll show them. Yeah, that's going to make the devil happy. So anyway, look at this on page 45. Now remember I told you last week, the man who wrote this book is leaving the field to go be the director of his mission board. Remember that? Look what he says here, the second paragraph. To be clear, I'm intentionally making a distinction between the biblical word sin, also described in this book as partnership, and the popular inadequate word support. Every missionary should have just one home-sending church from which they are called, ordained, and to which they are directly accountable. One authority. And if you have a board and a church, you have two authorities. And excuse me, I've had more than one board director or board missionary try to tell me, no, my church is my only authority. My board, they defer to the church. Well, if they were doing it right, there wouldn't be any need for deference. There would just be a church.
And what if there's a conflict? Between
Exactly. Yeah. And so anyway, he says, I'm attempting here to encourage churches to realize the significance of the biblical word